Hello, and welcome to the trial of OJ Simpson, Part 3. The defense case. Simpson hired a team of high-profile defense lawyers, initially led by Robert Shapiro, who was previously a civil lawyer known for settling, and then subsequently by Johnny Cochran, who at that point was known for police brutality and civil rights cases. The team included noted defense attorney F. Lee Bailey, Robert Kardashian, Harvard appeals lawyer Alan Dershowitz, his student Robert Blazier, and Dean of Santa Clara University School of Law Gerald Uhlman. Assisting Cochran were Carl E. Douglas and Sean Hawley. Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld were also hired. They headed the Innocence Project and specialized in DNA evidence. Simpson's defense was said to have cost between $3 million and $6 million. The media dubbed the group of talented attorneys the Dream Team, while the taxpayer cost of prosecution was over $9 million. Theory. The defense team's reasonable doubt theory was summarized as compromised, contaminated, corrupted in opening statements. They argued that the DNA evidence against Simpson was compromised by the mishandling of criminalists Dennis Fung and Andrea Mazzola during the collection phase of evidence gathering, and that 100% of the real killer's DNA had vanished from the evidence samples. The evidence was then contaminated in the LAPD crime lab by criminalist Colin Yamachi, and Simpson's DNA from his reference file was transferred to all but 3 exhibits. The remaining 3 exhibits were planted by the police and thus corrupted by police fraud. The defense also questioned the timeline, claiming the murders happened around 11 p.m. that night. Timeline. Dr. Robert Huizenga testified on July 14, 1995, that Simpson was not physically capable of carrying out the murders due to chronic arthritis and old football injuries. During cross-examination, the prosecution produced an exercise video that Simpson made a few weeks before the murders titled OJ Simpson, Minimum Maintenance, Fitness for Men, which demonstrated that Simpson was anything but frail. Dr. Huizenga admitted afterwards that Simpson could have committed the murders if he was in the throes of an adrenaline rush. Dr. Michael Bodden, a forensic pathologist, testified that the murders happened closer to 11 p.m., which is when Simpson has an alibi, and stated that Brown was still conscious, standing, and took a step after her throat was cut, and that Goldman was standing and fighting his assailant for 10 minutes with a lacerated jugular vein. After the trial, Bodden admitted his claim of Goldman's long struggle was inaccurate, and that testifying for Simpson was a mistake. Critics claimed that Bodden knowingly gave false testimony in order to collect a $100,000 retainer, compromised and contaminated. Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld argued that the results from the DNA testing were not reliable because the police were sloppy in collecting and preserving it from the crime scene. Fung and Mazzola did admit to making several mistakes during evidence collection, which included not always changing gloves between handling evidence items, packaging and storing the evidence items using plastic bags rather than paper bags as recommended, and storing them in the police van, which was not refrigerated, for up to 7 hours after collection. This, they argued, would allow bacteria to degrade all of the real killer's DNA, and thus make the samples more susceptible to cross-contamination in the LAPD crime lab. The prosecution denied that the mistakes made by Fung and Mazzola changed the validity of the results. They noted that all of the evidence samples were testable, and that most of the DNA testing was done at the 2 consulting labs, not the LAPD crime lab where contamination supposedly happened. Since all of the samples the consulting labs received were testable, while Scheck and Neufeld's theory predicted that they should have been inconclusive after being 100% degraded, the claim that all of the DNA was lost to bacterial degradation was not credible. The prosecution denied that contamination happened in the LAPD crime lab as well, because the result would be a mixture of the real killer's DNA and Simpson's DNA. But the results showed that only Simpson's DNA was present. The prosecution also noted the defense declined to challenge any of those results by testing the evidence themselves. Marcia Clark called Scheck and Neufeld's claims a smokescreen. The contamination claim was made by microbiologist Dr. John Gertis. He testified on August 2, 1995, that forensic PCR DNA matching is not reliable, and the LAPD crime lab has a substantial contamination problem. It is chronic in the sense that it doesn't go away. Gertis testified that because of the LAPD's history of contamination, he would not consider any of the PCR DNA matches in this case reliable because the tests were carried out by the LAPD. He also claimed that the consulting lab's PCR DNA matches were not reliable, as the evidence they tested went through the LAPD for packaging and shipping. Gertis believed only 3 of the DNA matches to have been valid, which were the same 3 the defense alleged were planted by the police. During cross-examination, Dr. Gertis admitted there was no evidence that cross-contamination had occurred, and that he was only testifying to what might occur, and not what actually did occur. He accepted that the victim's blood was in the Bronco, and Simpson's blood was at the crime scene, and neither was due to contamination. He also conceded that nothing happened during packaging and shipping that would affect the validity of the results at the 2 consulting labs. The prosecution implied that Gertis was not a credible witness. He had no forensic experience and had only testified for criminal defendants in the past, and always said the DNA evidence against them was not reliable due to contamination. Clark also implied that it was not a coincidence that the 3 evidence items he initially said were valid were the same 3 the defense claimed were planted, while the other 58 were all false positives, and the 47 substrate controls, which are used to determine if contamination occurred, were all false negatives. Defense forensic DNA expert Dr. Henry Lee testified on August 24, 1995, and admitted that Gertis's claim was highly improbable. Barry Scheck's 8-day cross-examination of Dennis Fung was lauded in the media. However, Howard Coleman, president of Seattle-based forensic DNA laboratory GeneLex, criticized Scheck's cross-examination as smoke and mirrors and stated, "Everything we get in the lab is contaminated to some degree. What contamination and degradation will lead you to is an inconclusive result. It doesn't lead you to a false positive." Police conspiracy allegation. The defense initially only claimed that 3 exhibits were planted by the police, but eventually argued that virtually all of the blood evidence against Simpson was planted in a police conspiracy. They accused prison nurse Thano Paradas, criminalists Dennis Fung, Andrea Mazzola, and Colin Yamachi, Ann Van Adder and Furman of participating in a plot to frame Simpson. In closing arguments, Cochran called Furman and Van Adder twins of deception, and told the jury to remember Van Adder as the man who carried the blood, and Furman as the man who found the glove. EDTA. The only physical evidence offered by the defense that the police tried to frame Simpson was the allegation that 2 of the 108 DNA evidence samples tested in the case contained the preservative ethylene diamine tetraacetic acid, or EDTA. Ironically, it was the prosecution who asked to have the samples tested for the preservative, not the defense. The defense alleged that the drop of blood on the back gate at the Bundy crime scene, which matched Simpson, and the blood found on a pair of socks in Simpson's bedroom, which matched Brown, were planted by the police. In order to support the claim, the defense pointed to the presence of EDTA, a preservative found in the purple-topped collection tubes used for police reference files, in the samples. On July 24, 1995, Dr. Frederick Reeders, a forensic toxicologist who had analyzed results provided by FBI Special Agent Roger Martz, testified that the level of EDTA in the evidence samples was higher than that which is normally found in blood. This appeared to support the claim they came from the reference vials. During cross-examination, Clark asked Dr. Reeders to read out loud the portion of the EPA article that stated what the normal levels of EDTA in blood are, which he referenced during his testimony. This demonstrated that he misread it, and that the levels found in the evidence samples were consistent with those found in blood that was not preserved in a police reference vial. Dr. Reeders then claimed it was a typo, but the prosecution produced a direct copy from the EPA confirming the normal amounts of EDTA found in unpreserved blood. The prosecution also had Dr. Reeders admit that EDTA is also found in food, and specifically the ingredients used in McDonald's Big Mac and French fries that Simpson had eaten earlier that night with Cato Kalin. FBI Special Agent Roger Martz was called by the defense on July 25, 1995, to testify that EDTA was present in the evidence samples, yet instead said he did not identify EDTA in the blood contradicting the testimony given by Dr. Reeders the day before. Initially, he conceded the blood samples responded like EDTA responded and was consistent with the presence of EDTA, but clarified his response after hearing during the lunch break that everyone is saying that I found EDTA, but I am not saying that. When the defense accused their own witness of changing his demeanor to favor the prosecution, he replied, I cannot be entirely truthful by only giving yes and no answers. Martz stated that it was impossible to ascertain with certainty the presence of EDTA, as while the presumptive test for EDTA was positive, the identification test for EDTA was inconclusive. Martz also tested his own unpreserved blood and got the same results for EDTA levels as the evidence samples, which he said conclusively disproved the claim the evidence blood came from the reference vials. He contended that the defense had jumped to conclusions from the presumptive test results, while his tests had in fact shown that those bloodstains did not come from preserved blood. Back gate. The defense alleged that Simpson's blood on the back gate at the Bundy crime scene was planted by the police. The blood on the back gate was collected on July 3, 1995, rather than June 13th, the day after the murders. The volume of DNA on that blood was significantly higher than the other blood evidence collected on June 13th. The volume of DNA was so high that the defense conceded that it could not be explained by contamination in the lab, yet noted that it was unusual for that blood to have more DNA on it than the other samples collected at the crime scene, especially since it had been left exposed to the elements for several weeks and after the crime scene had supposedly been washed over. On March 20th, 1995, Van Adder testified that he instructed Fung to collect the blood on the gate on June 13th, and Fung admitted he had not done so. The defense suggested the reason why Fung did not collect the blood is because it was not there that day. Scheck showed a blown-up photograph taken of the back gate on June 13th, and he admitted he could not see it in the photograph. The prosecution responded by showing that a different photograph showed that the blood was present on the back gate on June 13th, and before the blood had been taken from Simpson's arm. Officer Robert Risk was the first officer to the crime scene, and the one who pointed out the blood on the back gate to Furman, who documented it in his notes that night. Multiple other officers also testified under oath that the blood was present on the back gate the night of the murders. The prosecution also pointed out that the media cameras present proved that Van Adder never returned to the Bundy crime scene, Brown's home, that evening, where Simpson's blood was allegedly planted. Bronco. Barry Scheck alleged the police had twice planted the victim's blood inside Simpson's Bronco. An initial collection was made on June 13th. The defense accused Van Adder of planting the victim's blood in the Bronco when he returned to Simpson's home later that evening. The prosecution responded that the Bronco had already been impounded by the time Van Adder returned and was not even at Rockingham. Socks. The defense alleged that the police had planted Brown's blood on the socks found in Simpson's bedroom. The socks were collected on June 13th and had blood from both Simpson and Brown, but her blood on the socks was not identified until August 4th. The socks were found by Furman, but the defense suggested Van Adder planted the blood. He had received both blood reference vials from the victims earlier that day from the coroner and booked them immediately into evidence. Van Adder then drove back to Rockingham later that evening to hand-deliver the reference vial for Simpson to Fung, which the defense alleged gave him opportunity to plant the blood. Fung testified he could not see blood on the socks he collected from Simpson's bedroom, but the prosecution later demonstrated that those bloodstains are only visible underneath a microscope. Van Adder denied planting Brown's blood on the socks. The video from Willie Ford indicated that the socks had already been collected and stored in the evidence van before Van Adder arrived, and footage from the media cameras present appeared to prove that he never went inside the evidence van when he arrived at Rockingham. Glove. The last exhibit allegedly planted was the bloody glove found at Simpson's property by Furman. Unlike the sock and the back gate, the defense provided no physical or eyewitness evidence to support their claim that the prosecution could then refute. Jeffrey Toobin published an article in the New Yorker months before the trial began, which cited a source in Simpson's defense team that they intended to accuse Furman of planting the glove, with the motive being racism. Robert Shapiro later admitted he was Toobin's source. Defense attorney F. Lee Bailey suggested that Furman found the glove at the crime scene, picked it up with a stick and placed it in a plastic bag, and then concealed it in his sock when he drove to Simpson's home with detectives Lang, Van Adder, and Phillips. Bailey suggested that he then planted the glove in order to frame Simpson, with the motive either being racism or a desire to become the hero in a high-profile case. Scheck also suggested that Furman broke into Simpson's Bronco and used the glove like a paintbrush to plant blood onto and inside the Bronco. The prosecution denied that Furman planted the glove. They noted that several officers had already combed over the crime scene for almost 2 hours before Furman arrived, and none had noticed a second glove at the scene. Lang testified that 14 other officers were there when Furman arrived, and all said there was only one glove at the crime scene. Lieutenant Frank Spangler also testified that he was with Furman for the duration of his time there, and stated he would have seen Furman purloin the glove if he had in fact done so. Clark added that Furman did not know whether Simpson had an alibi, if there were any witnesses to the murders, whose blood was on the glove, that the Bronco belonged to Simpson, or whether Kalin had already searched the area where the glove was found. During cross-examination by Bailey, Furman denied that he had used a racial slur to describe African Americans in the 10 years prior to his testimony. A few months later, the defense discovered audio tapes of Furman repeatedly using the word, 41 times in total, 8 years before the murders. The Furman tapes became the cornerstone of the defense's case that Furman's testimony lacked credibility. Clark called the tapes the biggest red herring there ever was. After McKinney was forced to hand over the tapes to the defense, Furman says he asked the prosecution for a redirect to explain the context of those tapes, but the prosecution and his fellow police officers abandoned him after Ito played the audio tapes in open court for the public to hear. The public reaction to the tapes was explosive, and compared to the video of the Rodney King beating from a year prior. After the trial, Furman said that he was not a racist and apologized for his previous language, saying he was play acting for a screenplay when he made the tapes, and had been asked to be as dramatic as possible. Many of his minority former co-workers expressed support for him. On September 6, 1995, Furman was called back to the witness stand by the defense after the prosecution refused to redirect him to answer more questions. The jury was absent, but the exchange was televised. Furman, facing a possible prosecution for perjury, was instructed by his attorney to invoke the Fifth Amendment to avoid self-incrimination to 2 consecutive questions he was asked. Defense attorney Uhlman asked Furman if it was his intention to plead the Fifth to all questions, and Furman's attorney instructed him to reply yes. Uhlman then briefly spoke with the other members of the defense and said that he had just one more question. Did you plant or manufacture any evidence in this case? Following his attorney's instruction, Furman replied, I choose to assert my Fifth Amendment privilege. Cochran responded to Furman's pleading the Fifth by accusing the other officers of being involved in a cover-up to protect Furman, and asked Judge Ito to suppress all of the evidence that Furman found. Ito denied the request, stating that pleading the Fifth does not imply guilt, and there was no evidence of fraud. Cochran then asked that the jury be allowed to hear Furman taking the Fifth, and again Ito denied his request. Ito also criticized the defense's theory of how Furman allegedly planted the glove, stating, it would strain logic to believe that. On June 15, 1995, Christopher Darden surprised Marcia Clark by asking Simpson to try on the gloves found at the crime scene and his home. The prosecution had earlier decided against asking Simpson to try them on because they had been soaked in blood from Simpson, Brown, and Goldman, and frozen and unfrozen several times. Instead, they presented a witness who testified that Brown had purchased a pair of those gloves in the same size in 1990 at Bloomingdale's for Simpson, along with a receipt and a photo during the trial of Simpson earlier wearing the same type of gloves. The leather gloves appeared to be too tight for Simpson to put on easily, especially over the latex gloves he wore underneath. Clark claimed that Simpson was acting when he appeared to be struggling to put on the gloves, yet Cochran replied, I don't think he could act the size of his hands. Darden then told Ito of his concerns that Simpson has arthritis, and we looked at the medication he takes, and some of it is anti-inflammatory, and we are told he has not taken the stuff for a day, and it caused swelling in the joints and inflammation in his hands. Cochran informed Ito the next day that Sean Chapman contacted the Los Angeles County Jail doctor who confirmed Simpson was taking his arthritis medication every day and that the jail's medical records verified this. Ullman came up with, and Cochran repeated, a quip he used in his closing arguments. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. The prosecution stated they believed the gloves shrank from having been soaked in the blood of the victims. Richard Rubin, former vice president of glove maker Eris Isotoner Inc., which makes the gloves in question, testified on September 12, 1995, that the gloves had indeed shrunk from their original size. Darden produced a new pair of the same type of gloves, which fitted Simpson when he tried them on. After the trial, Cochran revealed that Bailey had goaded Darden into asking Simpson to try on the gloves, and that Shapiro had told Simpson in advance how to give the appearance that they did not fit. Summation. In closing arguments, Darden ridiculed the notion that police officers might have wanted to frame Simpson. He questioned why, if the LAPD was against Simpson, they went to his house 8 times on domestic violence calls against Brown between 1986 and 1988, but did not arrest him. They only arrested him on charges of abuse in January 1989, when photos of Brown's face were entered into the record. Darden noted the police did not arrest Simpson for 5 days after the 1994 murders. During the prosecution's closing argument, Cochran and Scheck very notably objected 71 times in order to lessen its effect on the jury. And though Ito overruled 69 of them, he did not once admonish Cochran or Scheck or threaten them with contempt of court for their behavior. In Cochran's summation to the jury, he was unable to refute any of the prosecution's claims, so he instead dedicated his entire argument to attacking the LAPD, particularly Furman, Lang, and Van Adder. He emphasized that Furman was proved to have repeatedly referred to black people by the N-word, and also to have boasted of beating young black men in his role as a police officer. Cochran compared Furman to Adolf Hitler and referred to him as a genocidal racist, a perjurer, America's worst nightmare, and the personification of evil, and claimed without proof that Furman had planted the glove in an attempt to frame Simpson for the murders based purely on his dislike of interracial couples. Cochran also presented a piece of paper to the jury with the title, Van Adder's Big Lies, and claimed, without any evidence or proof, that Van Adder had returned to the crime scene with Simpson's blood to plant it there, despite Van Adder having previously testified that he had given it to Dennis Fung in order to avoid the exhibits from getting mixed up. Cochran referred to Lang and Van Adder as the 2 devils of deception, and very notably implored the jurors to stop this cover-up and acquit Simpson and send the police a message, which was interpreted by many as a naked appeal for jury nullification. Following his summation, Cochran received numerous death threats and hired bodyguards from Louis Farrakhan. In response, Fred Goldman, who was himself Jewish, referred to Cochran himself as the worst kind of racist ever and a sick man for comparing Furman to Hitler while associating himself with Farrakhan, who was widely considered a black supremacist and anti-Semite, while Robert Shapiro, also Jewish, expressed that he was particularly offended by Cochran comparing Furman's claims to the Holocaust, claiming that no comparison would ever be possible. In an interview regarding Vincent Bugliosi's analysis on the case, Van Adder claimed that he was so infuriated at Cochran's claims about him that he felt a desire to strangle him in the courtroom.